Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Ayin Vav. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with our daf. We're going to finish the 7th chapter today. And our topic is really all about how do we get to this solet that we've been talking about all this time. How do they form the solet? So the first thing you need to understand is that a kernel of wheat or barley has 3 parts to it. It has the germ, right, it's what we call wheat germ, the bran, it's kind of the outside coating, and the endosperm in the center. Now, what we want to do to make the flour is we want to get the endosperm. And then, once we get the part from the inside, just the center, we want to get all the other parts off. Then we're going to sift that down, right? We're going to grind it and sift it into very fine flour. But again, not really just so that it's so fine. We don't want it powdery, right? We want it to be, we've talked about this before, like granules. So today we're going to learn about the process. The first process you have to do is take those kernels. Okay, this is after you've done all the process of the gathering and the winnowing and all that. Now you have the wheat grains. You want to take them and you want to you're going to roll them twice. 300 times. Like we'll talk about the twice in a minute. You're going to roll them probably on some sort of like sandpaper kind of table to get the bran off of it. And then you're going to beat them 500 times. You're going to do 300 shifa, 300 times of rolling them, okay, and this back and forth motion, and 500 times of be'ita, which the caveat of Rashi has a bunch of different interpretations of what this is, whether it's kicking it. The last explanation is maybe it's even kicking it with your feet, but likely it's pounding it with your hand, okay? So they would do that 300 times and that 500 times, and that would be to basically get rid of the outer part, okay, and the germ, okay, to get as much as you can off of it and to get to the endosperm. Now, the way that generally this is done nowadays, and probably then too, was to first soak it in water to soften it. The problem is you can't do that because it's chametz. So, right, you're not allowed to have any of these menachot. The solet has to be not chametz, so you can't get it wet, and that's why this is the only thing you have to do. Right? The Kohanim did this. You can imagine how blistery their hands must have been. Shifa be'ita b'chitim. So Tanakama says, as we just explained, this process, the 300 and the 500 times, are done to the grains. But Rabbi Yossi Omer Babatzik says, no, it's to the dough. Okay, makes sense, right? The dough, it's like kneading. You beat it and you move it back and forth, and you beat it, you pound it down. So you have to do it to the dough to make the dough better. So there's this machloket about whether the sheaf and be'ita have to be with the kernels or with the dough. Kol ha-menachot ba'ot 10. Second issue in the Mishnah. All the menachot that we do come with 10 loaves. Okay, we talked about this before. Chutz mi lechem hapanim v'chavitei kohen gadol she'em ba'ot 12. Other than 2 exceptions to the rule, we're going to see where we get this all from. The lechem hapanim and the chavitei kohen gadol come as 12 loaves. Okay. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kulam ba'ot 12, chutz michalot todah u'nizirut, she'em ba'ot 10. He says, no, it's the opposite. Everything is 12 other than 2 that are 10. So we have either everything is 10 except for 2 that are 12, or everything is 12 except for the 2 that are 10. Which 2 are 10 according to him? The chalot of the todah offering and the nizirut, and a nazir that has to bring with one of their offerings. There's the shlamim that comes with breads. So now we're going to have the Gemara is going to start. Okay, I won't talk yet about the derivation and where this all comes from. We're going to see this all inside. Which parts are clear from the Torah, which parts are all derived. Okay, so and why specifically, like what's the basis of the machlokah between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda? So we'll start with the Gemara that talks about the shifa and be'ita. Tana. Now, in order to do 300 shifa and 500 be'ita, you might have thought, okay, first do the pounding 300 times. By the way, this is for every kernel. It seems an insane process. First do 300 shifa, then 500 be'ita, but no, they say like this. Tana, in the Braita, it says, Shaf echad bo'et shtayim, do 1 shifa, 2 be'itot, okay, 1, right, going back and forth, 2 banging, Shaf shtayim bo'et shalosh, and then you do 2 shifas and 3 be'itas, and with that you get the ratio of every 3 you're going to do 5. Okay, for every 3 shifot, you're going to do 5 be'itot, which is the 300 to 500, right, till you get up to 300. You can imagine what it was like to count it, to be on top of this, right? It seems like a lot. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, am tuyeh v'tuyeh chad, udel am tuyeh v'tuyeh trei. So Rabbi Yirmiyah, a classic question. He says, back and forth, is that considered 1 or is that 2? Back, forth. So when we say Shifa 300, is it 300 back and forth or 300 altogether? Back, forth, 300. It's like swimming laps, right? So 1 is 1 there and back, or is 1 there and then 2 is back. Same idea. So now we go back to this machloket between Rabbi Yossi and the Tanna Kama about what we're doing Shifa Be'ita to, and there's a question about how to understand the machloket. Shifa Be'ita B'chitim, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Batsek, Ibayelu. Now they ask the following question. Be'batsek v'lo b'chitim, o dilma af be'batsek. When Rabbi Yossi says in the dough, does he mean in addition to doing the Shifa and the Be'ita on the grains, then on the kernels of wheat, then you have to do it also on the dough? Or does he mean only the dough? Tashma, let's learn from the following source. In our Gemara, it's not so clear because the Tanna Kama says Shifu be'ita b'chitin, and then Rabbi Yossi says be'batsek, which could be, well, maybe also be'batsek. But in the Braita, it seems pretty clear that he doesn't mean that because Shifu be'ita b'chitin, Rabbi Yossi omel Shifu be'ita b'batsek. Now this has 2 words that are different, which is when Rabbi Yossi speaks, he says Shifa and be'ita is with the dough, which sounds like he's saying Shiva and Bita is only with the dough, because the fact that he repeats it sounds like he's not saying, I agree with you and I'm adding. Sounds like he's saying his own thing completely. Now we're going to get to the big derivations today of how we get 10 and how we get 12. This is the main part of our sugya today. Kol Menachot ba'ot, right? Eser, other than the 2 that come Shtei Esrei, Rabbi Yehuda. Lechem apanim. So how do we know the 2 that come 12? Lechem apanim behed yaktiv be. That's the only place where this appears explicitly. It says in Vayikra 24, chapter 24, V'lakachta solet va'afita ota shtem esrei chalot. Okay, 24 chalot, shnei esronim yeh chala achat. Each one is 2 esronim. That's not so important for our purposes, but the main thing is that you need 12 loaves. Very clear. Okay, so that's the first one. Only one that it says explicitly. Chavitei kohen gadol, where do we get it from? Atya chuka milechem apanim. So lechem apanim, it says chok olam. And by the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, it says Chok Olam. So there you have Chuka, same word appears, Gezerah Shabbat. So from Lechem Apanim, we learn to the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's the end. One teaches the other, but that's it. The rest, the Kol HaMenachot, Debaot Eser Minal. And where do we get the rest from? Gamar mi Lachmei Todah. Now the Gemara doesn't tell us where you got Lachmei Todah, but the commentaries tell us that the issue with Lachmei Todah is like this. In the lechamim, it says you're supposed to give 1 challah of each type. If you remember, there's 4 different types that you bring of loaves for the lechem todah. Goes with the Thanksgiving offering. It's 1 of each type that you have to give to the kohen, and it's called a truma. So 1 loaf you have to give to the kohen. Then they derive Gezerah Shavah from maaser, truma maaser, which is the truma that the Levi has to give. The Levi gets a 10th, and then the Levi has to give a 10th of his 10th to the kohen. And there it's a 10th. So it must be here it's a 10th. So if the Kohen gets 1, and it's called Truma, it must be that there's 10 altogether. And that's how they assume it's 10. So Mal Halan Eser, Afkan Eser. So then they say, and all the other Menachot are learned from the Lechem HaPanim. So now from the Lachmei Todah. So now the obvious question is, right? We have one paradigm, which is, we have the Lechem HaPanim, which from there we learn to the Chavitei Kohen Gadol. The other is the Lachmei Todah. Why don't we learn from Lachmei Todah? Why are we learning from Lachmei Todah to the other Menachot, meaning really the voluntary ones, the Soled and the Ma'afet Tanur and the Merchvad and the Mercheshet? Why are we learning? Those all have to come 10 loaves. Where do we get it from? We get it from the Lachmei Todah. Why don't we get it 12? Right, which is what Rabbi Meir actually does. Why don't we learn from Lechem HaPanim? So Mal Halan Shtem Esrei, Afkan Shtem Esrei. What do we say? That's 12. The rest of them are 12. And now we're going to basically prove why Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say it. And then we're going to undo this when we get to Rabbi Meir and say, oh, that must be why Rabbi Meir does it. Okay, or at least somewhat. So now we're going to see. So, Mistabra, Milachmei Todah Havalei Lamelech. We're going to do one of these games. Which is more similar to which? So, it's more likely we're going to learn the regular Menachot from Lachmei Todah. Why? From the loaves of the Thanksgiving offering. Shekain Yachid. They're both individuals, as opposed to Lechem HaPanim, which is communal. Mitnadev, they're both voluntary. Lechem HaPanim is obligatory. Shemen, they both have oil mixed in, whereas the Lechem HaPanim doesn't have oil. And Nifsal, which is they're disqualified if you leave them overnight, whereas the Lechem HaPanim is left there for 7 days. Shalo b'Shabbat v'shalo b'Tumah. You can't do it on Shabbat. Right? You can't bring Menachot, voluntary Menachot, nor can you bring the Thanksgiving offering. And if everyone's Tameh or the majority of people are Tameh, you can't bring it. Whereas you're allowed to do, right, on Shabbat, and specifically lechem hapanim was always prepared on Shabbat and put out on the table on Shabbat, and betuma, okay? And it was permitted if everyone or the majority of the people were tmeim. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Adrabah, you could say the opposite. Mi lechem hapanim avalei lemelech. You could learn it from lechem hapanim. Sheken. Now we're going to see how many ways is similar. The menachot, the regular menachot, right? The voluntary ones to the lechem hapanim more so than the lachmei todah. Sheken hekdesh. They're both kodshe kodshim. Lachmei todah go with the todah offering, which is a shlamim, which is kodshim kalim. Levona, it doesn't have any levona, and the regular mincha offerings have levona, frankincense, and we know the lechem hapanim is those 2 bowls of frankincense with it. Matzah, okay, only the lechmei todah or chametz. These are not chametz, right? Only that and the shtei alechem, but we're not talking about the shtei alechem. The regular mincha and the lechem hapanim are matzah; they're not leavened, and etzem, and they come on their own. The lechmei todah come along with a Thanksgiving sacrifice. That's an animal; it's secondary to the animal offering. And now they're going to answer. So why don't we learn from lechem hapanim? And the answer, hanach nefishin. There's more ways that it's similar to the lechmei todah, right? It's just a numbers game than it is to the lechem hapanim, and that's why we're going to learn it from the lechmei todah, 10 loaves. Now they say v'isfir alach. Now they're going to further ask Rabbi Yehuda. Wait a minute, isfir alach. If you hold, and this was a whole subject of it was a question. In Zvachim Daf Nun, if you'll remember in a minute maybe, Davar Lamei B'Gzera Shavach Chozerum Lamei B'Binyan Av. Do you remember around Daf Nun we had all these? If you learn by Hekesh, can you learn a Hekesh? And if you learn from Gzera Shavach, can you also learn a Binyan Av? And there were all these permutations that we tried to do. So if you hold that if you learn something from Gzera Shavach, you can then use that as a paradigm. Then Ne'elef Mi Chavitei Kohen Gadol. Then why don't we compare it to the Chavitei Kohen Gadol and say, fine, you can't learn it from Lechem hapanim because it's more similar to Lechmei Todah. But maybe if we compare the regular minchas to the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, maybe we'll see it's more similar than to the Lachmei Todah. And in fact, we're going to see it is. There's more ways it's similar to the Chavitei Kohen Gadol than it is to the Lachmei Todah, the ones that go with the Thanksgiving offering. So let's see our list. So why don't we learn Chavitei Kohen Gadol? Malalan Shtemeser, Avkan Shtemeser, right? That was derived from the Lechem hapanim, and then we can get, okay, from then the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, we'll learn to all the other minchas. Mistabra milachmei todah havel. So first they're going to say, no, let's go through our list again and see what ways are the lachmei todah similar to the regular menachot and different from the Chavitei Kohen Gadol. Sheken hedyot, it's a regular person, not a Kohen Gadol who brings it. Shit nadev, it's a nadava, not obligatory. Chatzain, it doesn't come in halves. And the Chavitim, the Kohen Gadol, come in halves. By the way, I forgot to mention, they come 12, right? There's a debate about whether you bring 6 in the morning, 6 in the evening, or we've talked about this before, or half of the 12 loaves get brought in the morning and half get brought in the afternoon. Okay? But these are brought whole, the regular menachot and the lachmei todah. Pigul, they both have pigul, whereas there's no pigul in the Chavitei Kohen Gadol because they get completely burned. And then there's no matir, there's nothing that gets permitted on account of bringing them. It just, the sacrifice is to just burn it, so there is no pigul. Shalom b'Shabbat v'shalom b'Tumah, and the Chavitei Kohen Gadol is allowed to be done Shabbat, allowed to be done in impurity, whereas obviously the Menachot can't be, and neither can the Lachmei Todah. But then they say Adrabah. Now they're going to list, like I said, a much longer list. Chavitei Kohen Gadol havalei l'melech. Should have learned it from there. Shekain isaron. They both come 1 isaron, whereas the Lachmei Todah are 20 esronim for all of them. That's a lot. These are 1 isaron. Chavitei Kohen Gadol is 1 isaron, and the other the regular mincha comes 1 isaron. Kli, they both become sanctified in a vessel. Okay, they're both brought, the dough is put in a vessel and they're sanctified there. Whereas the loaves of the Lachmei Todah are actually all prepared outside the temple, even baked outside the temple. When do they become sanctified? When you slaughter the animal that goes with it. Hekdesh, they're both kochim and the Lachmei Todah are kochim kalim. Levona, like we said before, there's no levona with it, but there is with the Menchat Chavitim of the Kohen Gadol and with the regular Menachot. Matzah, they're both matzah, and the Lachmei Todah are chametz, etzem, it comes along with another korban, whereas the regular Menchat and the Chavitei Kohen Gadol are standalones. Hagasha, they both need to be brought to the altar, and Ishim, and they're burnt on the altar. Right? The Thanksgiving loaves are not brought to the altar, they're not burned on the altar. And Hani Nefishim, and this is a much longer list. To which they answered, you're right, it's a longer list, but in the end we're going to go by what its essence is. Hedyot me, hedyot adifle. We'd rather learn a korban that's brought by an individual from a korban brought by an individual or by a regular person rather than a kohen gadol. So that's not going to be the paradigm. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Meir, and as I said, some of this is going to be what we rejected previously. Rabbi Meir omer kolam ba'ot 12, mai kasavar. What does he hold? Isfir alei dedavar lamei b'gzera shavach chozer lamei b'binyanav yalef michavitei kohen gadol dahan nefishin. That's what we just did. If you hold that you can learn something from Gzera Shava and then from there build it as a paradigm, then we can learn from the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, which was learned out from the Lechem HaPanim. From there we can learn from the Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol to everything else. And also it makes sense because it's a longer list, the comparison. Now if you're not willing to learn it from a binyanav, if you learn Gzera Shava, learn from binyanav, we can't learn it from there. So the only place to learn is from Lechem HaPanim. What's the problem? Well, we already said that it was more similar. It had much more similarities to the mincha, to the lachmei todah, to the Thanksgiving loaves. So they say, well, hekdesh me hekdesh adifle. We'd still rather learn it from lechem hapanim because both are high-level sanctity offerings, kodesh kodshim, rather than the lachmei todah, which are kodshim kalin. So we'll learn again based on its essence. Okay, now we get to Chutz milachmei todah u'nizirut she'em ba'ot eser. Now, where do we get it? We should have started with this, but where do we get the lachmei todah? So, lachmei todah behed yaktivu. It says it explicitly, even though it doesn't really. But they view that 1 out of X. We assume X is 10. That's learned out from the Truma. That's pretty explicit. Nizirut. Why is Nizirut so clear to everybody that it's 10? Right into Rabbi Meir, who thinks those are the only ones that are 10. Da'amar mar shlamav l'rabot shalmei nazil. So it says by the lachmei todah, it says zevach shlamav. Okay, you're supposed to. It says al chalot lechem atzot yakriv korbanot al zevach todat shlamav. Should bring the bread with the shlamav. Say shlamav is a reference to the nazir. There's loaves, and if there's 10 loaves here, there's 10 loaves there. Okay, even though there's 40 loaves altogether, but of each type. Okay, the nazir also has 2 different types. It doesn't have 4, it has 2. Amar Rav Tuvi bar Kisna. So now we finished all that. Now Rav Tuvi bar Kisna says Amar Shmuel. He says in the name of Shmuel, Lachmei todah she'afa'an arba chalot. What if you took the same amount of dough, but you made 4 gigantic loaves out of it rather than 10? Yotza, rather than 40, sorry. 1 of each of the 4 types. So you made 1 of each type instead of 10 of each type. So we just said you're supposed to make 10. What if you didn't? So you fulfill your obligation. You say, what are you talking about? Ba'abin and arba'in, but you need 40. Lemitzvah, that's just ideally. But wait, if you do 1 and you have to take truma from it, how are you going to take truma? Now the obvious is you're going to cut a piece off. But what's the problem with that? Well, if you say each of the 4 will just slice a piece off, echad amar Rachmana. So the Torah said, "Hikriv mimenu echad mikol korban truma laHashem." That's the pasuk where we learn truma. Okay, and that it's 1/10. It says 1 from each. Why do you have to say 1 from each? Shelo yitol parus. From there you learn it has to be a whole one. So how are you going to do that? If you only have 4, you're going to have to give some to the Kohen. You're going to slice the piece. It's not going to be whole, right? You can imagine why it should be whole. It's just not respectable to give a Kohen a slice of bread. So they say the afreshinu belisha. Now the way to do it, if you did 4 loaves, you could be yotze as long as while you were kneading the dough, you already separated out the part for the Kohen. And the Kohen has his own loaf. It's baked separately. You either give it to him as dough or you give it to him cooked, baked, either which way. But the point is you have 4 loaves after the truma was taken. Meitive. But now we have a difficulty from a Tanaitic source on Shmuel, who said, again, you don't need the exact amount of lachmei todah. It's still going to work, even though you should. Okay, so either you put too many or too few. You didn't have the right number. Are all kshirot. They're all fine. Except for those 4. What makes those 4 unique? Why are they specifically the ones that have to have exact number? Before we get to the contradiction. The contradiction is obvious. It says you have to have them. They're not good if not. And for lachmei todah. And Shmuel said it's fine for lachmei todah if you only have 4. But why those 4? Because those are the 4 that are learned explicitly in the Pesukim, and there's also no debate about them. Everyone agrees those 2 are 12 and those 2 have 10. And they're pretty clear from the pasuk or derive very directly from the pasuk as opposed to the minchas, which went, right, the regular mincha voluntary ones, which went either way, and there was a debate about them. So it makes sense that there we could be more lenient about the number. These are much more explicit in the Torah or derive pretty directly. So what's the answer to the contradiction against Shmuel? Turning now to Amud Bet. Hu da'amar ki Tana, he held like a different Tana. It's a Tanaitic debate, and here we're going to see the Tanaitic debate. The Tanya, as it says in a Braita, Kol Menachot sheriba b'midat chalatan, o shemi'et b'midat chalatan ksherot. If you did too many or too few, they're fine. Chutz milechem apanim b'chavitei kohen gadol. So according to opinion number 1, matches Shmuel, right? Or Shmuel matches this opinion, which is only the lechem apanim and chavitei kohen gadol, which are the ones that really start with explicit in the text 12, where it said by lechem apanim and then the gzeira shava, as opposed to where we already derive lechem apanim from truma and it wasn't 100% clear. So just those two, and that's why Shmuel says the lachmei todah, if you do the Thanksgiving loaves, not exactly the right amount, or not even close. You did one of each, but as long as you have the right amount, the measure of Yisaron, it's fine. The Yeshomlim, af lachmei todah u'nizirut. And here's the other opinion, which is, no, it's really all 4, which is the one we saw before. Amar Rav Huna, along these same lines, Minchat Ma'afeh. Now we're up to the Minchat Ma'afeh, which is the one, right, the Rikikim, or the Chalot Matzot. Shafa'a Chala Achat Yatsa, my time, I know he gives a different reason. Matzot Ktiv, without a Vav. It says it, you read it as Matzat, which is singular, even though you read it meaning that's the way it reads. Even though you really read it, you pronounce it as Matzot. The word is plural, but, okay, I'll just read you the pasuk so you understand. But the way it looks in the print is matzat, which is singular. So they say, because it says matzat ktiv, which is singular. So one chala would be enough. Matka flour of papa, tamad ktiv matzat, haktiv matzot lo. Wait. So you're trying to tell me, if it says matzat without a vav, it doesn't matter how many. If it says matzot with a vav, it matters. Well, v'ha'gabei lachmei todah d'chtiv matzot. V'amar of Tuvi bar Kisna amar Shmuel lachmei todah shafan arba chalot yatsa. So, but wait, this completely goes against what Shmuel said, because matzot is with a vav. And Shmuel said that it doesn't have to be exact. And you just said, only because it doesn't have a vav, it doesn't have to be exact. But if it has a vav, it would have to be exact. And the matzot by the lachmei todah has a vav. So the answer, Shmuel disagrees with Rav Huna. Okay, he doesn't agree with his theory. With a vav, without a vav, that's what determines. Okay, that's the end of that section. We're moving now to the next Mishnah. As I said, a lot of what we're going to discuss today, not everything. I did kind of say that's the topic, but we did get off on this other topic of how many loaves, but it's really how do we get to this proper flour. So, Omer hayaba isaron mishalosh seim. We're now going to discuss the difference between the Omer, the shtei alechem, and the lechem aprim. The Mishnah doesn't explain why, but the Gemara is going to immediately go into why. So the Omer would be an isaron for 3 seim. 3 seim is an ephah. So you take an ephah of flour to whittle it down till you sift it and get out all the bad stuff until you get to, right, first you do the shipa and be'ita, then you grind it, turn it into flour, and then you start sifting the flour. How much flour do you have to start with? How many grains do you need to start with? 3 se'ah of grains, which is a whole ephah, to get to 1/10. So basically you're going to whittle it down to 1/10 of its size. That's what the Omer. Now remember, the Omer is not wheat, it's barley. You're going to take that same amount of 3 se'ah, but you're actually going to get 2/10 of an ephah out of that. So you're going to get double the amount. Basically, you're going to need to whittle it down to 1/5 of its size. And lechem apanim is 24 esronim, me-24 se'im. You're going to get 24 esronim because you need 2 per loaf, and it's 12 loaves. From 24 se'im, you're going to do 1 se'ah is going to create an isaron. That's 1/3. Okay, you're going to basically whittle it down to 1/3 of its size. So already you can see that there's a big difference between these 3 in the ratio. So the Gemara wants to know my time, but what's the reason? So they're starting with the first. The Omer is the most, and you're going to see the next Mishnah has the same ideas here, where we're going to be the most process is going to have to happen with the Omer. Why? It comes from the new grains, which have more of the subin in it, like the bran that has to come off. And it comes with barley, which is also more coarse. If you want to get to the real best isaron, you're going to need 3 se'ah. Shtei alechem, shtei asronot mishalosh se'in. Why is that better? Because michitin atin, it comes from wheat. So it's already better. Now it also has to come from the new crop. Remember the Omer and Shtei alechem, they're both right on, one is right after the day after the first day of Pesach, the other is on Shavuot. You need to bring from the new grains. But shtei asronim atu mishalosh sein. So even though it's chadash, but it is wheat, so it's better, so it's going to be a little less of a process. Lechem apanim 24 esronot me-24 sein. Why is this 1 to 3? Right, we're going to get a third. It's going to whittle down to a third only. My time kevan bechitenatu umiyashanatu. You can use this from the old grains as well, and therefore isaron muvchar ati misah. You're going to get a real good isaron even from just a seah. Tanu Rabbanan. Kol menachot sheriba b'midat esronan o shemi'et b'midat isaron psula. If you don't have the right measurement of the isaron, that is critical. Why is that critical? Because that's what the Torah says. The Torah says put an isaron or 2 esronim or 3 esronim, depending on which one, right? It has its special amount. You change that number, you've ruined your mincha. However, riba midat sein shalan o shemi'et b'midat sein shalan kshechot. But if you didn't start with 3 se'ah to get your one isaron for the omer, that's okay. That's just a durabanan of how to get the best solet. But if you didn't get the best solet, it's not going to ruin your mincha. Mishnah. Ha'omer hayam menupet b'shlosh nafa. You use 13 sifters to get to, okay, this you're going to see again. The omer is going to need a lot more sifting. Shtei alechem b'12, b'lechem apanim b'11. Okay, so each one again goes down a level. You only need 12 for the shtei alechem. You only need 11 for the lechem apanim. Rabbi Shimon Omer lo yalein kitzba. It doesn't have a set amount of how many times exactly. Ela solet menupet kol tzorkaya mivi. You just have to bring a very clean solet. Okay, Shenemal. How do we know this? He says, because the pasuk says, "V'lakachta solet v'afita ota." It says you're supposed to. Now, lakachta really means take or buy solet and bake it. Ad shtei menupeh kol tzarka. In other words, you need solet. It needs to be good quality solet. That's it. It doesn't say you have to sift it. It has to go through some process, right? And theoretically, we're going to see later, you can just also buy it. So if you can buy it, then obviously when you buy it, you don't know how many times did they sift it exactly. Just know it's good quality solet. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to have a debate, or sort of a debate. There's different ways about how to understand this, how they did the sifting. B'daka b'gasa, b'daka b'gasa. Okay, imagine there's 13 sifters, and they're from very, very small holes to very big holes. So you're going to go small holes, big holes, small holes, big holes. You're going to start with number 1, the smallest holes. You're going to go to number 13 with the biggest holes. Then you're going to go to 2, 12, 3, 11, like that. So you get to the middle ones, which aren't so much different. Now, what would happen in the small hole ones? What you're really going to get out, we talked about this in the past, is the powdery part. We don't want this to be powdery. This isn't powdery flour. You want to get all the powder out. So first you get a little powder in the beginning, then you put in the big one, and that takes out all the bad, the bran and the big pieces. Then you go to the next one, and you get out more powder, right? They're bigger holes, so it gets more powder out. And then you get out the smaller pieces of subin that are still there by going to the smaller holes on the other side, right? Number 12. And then you keep going until you end up with the right consistency. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, 13 nafot hayu b'mikdash, zo lamala mizo v'zo lamala mizo. Elyona koletet subim, tachtona koletet solet. He says there were 13, number 1 to 13, and you would basically start with the biggest holes and get down to the teeny holes. And you would end with the smallest holes. And what he says here very nicely is the Elyona koletet subim, the top part, right, in the bigger ones, the first ones you use, the bad stuff is at the top and the good stuff goes through the bottom. In the last one, you're going to end up, or the last few, the powder is going to go out the bottom and the good stuff is going to remain at the top. Rabbi Shimon omer lo hayalen kitzba. Okay, don't confuse Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, we just said, and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says there was no set amount. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to see the Braita like we saw in the Mishnah. They actually skipped the word velakachta, which is a very important word here. Velakachta solet ve'afita ota. Milamid shenikachat solet. You could buy it as solet, which means you obviously don't have to sift it all those times. Uminayin shafilu chitin. How do you know that? You can even buy chitim, because it sounds like you can only buy solet. It sounds like maybe you can't even buy the grains. Now it seems weird because we just said, right, according to the other opinion, you have to buy the grains and then you sift them. So, and make them into flour and then sift them. So how do you know that you can even buy the grains and do that? This, by the way, is for the lechem apanim specifically. Talmud Lamal velakachta mikol makom. Because it says velakachta, well, we mean you could buy it in any case. Even you could buy even the grains. Yachol af b'shar menachot kain. Now we're going to learn something interesting according to him. You might think that you could buy chitim for all the other menachot. Talmud Lomar ota. No, just the lechem apanim. Why? Mipnei chisachon. Well, because we want, what's chisachon? Okay, we know the Hebrew modern word of chisachon is saving money, and that comes from here. Or, I don't know if it's the only source, but you see here, they didn't really know what chisachon meant. My mipnei chisachon. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Torah chasa al mamonan shel Yisrael. Okay, chisachon from the lashon of chasa. The Torah has pity on the money of the Jewish people. They don't want us to spend a ton of money. Now, what's cheaper to buy? Grains and sift them yourself, right? Make them into flour and sift them, or buy the fine flour or the clean flour. Obviously, buying the clean flour is going to be the more expensive. So if we made you, for the lechem apanim, made the temple always be buying the flour already ready, we would have a problem because there would be no money, right? The Torah wants to save the money of the public funds. Right? We always talk about the debate between, on the one hand, we don't want poverty in the temple. We want things to look glorious and gold and all the beautiful things. On the other hand, we don't want things to go out of proportion and people have to, the public funds have to spend too much money. But that's not true for an individual mincha. For an individual mincha, we can make you buy, right? You can, theoretically, what he's saying is you actually can only buy the solet. What's the issue here? Well, we're worried you might not sift it properly, and we don't want korbanot to be brought from not the best of the best. So we actually make you buy the solet, according to Rabbi Shimon. Amar, last line, Hecha Remiza, where do we get this idea, the Torah chasa al mamonan shel Yisrael? D'chtiv v'ishkita et ha'ida ve'et bi'ram. This is when they didn't have water in the desert, in Parshat Chukat, and Moshe hits the rock, right? And then the water comes out, and God says the water is going to be for you and for your animals. You see that God has rachamanu on the animals as well, and the people have to feed the animals, and that the Torah was concerned for the property of the Jews, not just that God was concerned for the property of the Jews, and not just for the Jews themselves, also for their property, for their animals. And with that, Hadran alach elu menachot nechmatzot, nice idea to end the Masechet on about this, the parak on, about this nice idea of how the Torah is concerned for the property of the Jewish people and doesn't want to make them spend a lot of money, right? Sometimes it feels like mitzvot are a big financial burden, right? But there's always this balance to be found. Okay, with that, and it's interesting in a conversation all about the solet and the fine, this really high quality flour. On the other hand, right, there's some sort of balance to be found there. Okay, so now, right, that you could basically make it yourself instead of, right, that the temple should create their own flour rather than buying it and spending all this money. And it's also a good question about public funds versus individual funds, right? Well, you might spend yourself, but you shouldn't. If you're using public funds, be more careful about it. So a lot of good ideas come out of this. So what did we see? We saw the shifa and the be'ita, the beating and the rolling, right, to basically get to the endosperm of the grain. We saw the machloket about the 10 verses 12, which, right, some were obvious they're 12, the lachem apanim chavitei kohen gadol. We had the 2 that were obvious that they were 10, which is the lachmei tudah, and from there we learned to Nazir. And then the question is where the minchas go. Machloket Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and how to darshan which one is more similar to which, and what's going to be the overwhelming thing that's going to pull you to say, we're going to learn 12 for the others, or we're going to learn that they're 10. And then we got to this machloket between Shmuel and some opinion in a Braita, 2 different Tannaitic opinions, really, Shmuel and Rafuna also, about what if you only bake them 4 chalot, right? Would that work for the lachmei todah or not? Right? Which ones are the numbers critical? Which ones are they not critical for? Then we got to how much se'ah you need of grains in order to get to the best flour that you can, and it was different for different things because of the chadash issue and because of the barley issue. And then we got to also the sifting was different for those things for the exact same reasons, and how many times you have to sift it, and then there was a machloket about how exactly to sift it, and then Rabbi Shimon, we didn't think it really needed to be sifted at all, and was all into saying, well, really, you should buy the fine flour in most cases, except for when it's public funds, and we don't want to make you spend the money on that. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.